Kia ora everybody, we're back with Cliff Harvey. If you want to get a bit more in depth into this great man, in episode 7 we had a bit of a deep dive into who exactly Cliff Harvey is, where he's come from, and a little bit of where he is today. But Cliff, what did you do on the weekend, mate? You were just telling us before. It sounds very, very interesting.
Yeah, I was down in Wellington at the Australasian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine Cancer Symposium. So basically presenting down there on the use of ketosis, ketogenic diets, ketones for cancer, and so the application and I guess some of the cautions, some of the fish hooks. A lot of great talks down there, great organization, and sort of that perfect blend that I'd like to see of holistic worldview and evidence basis, strong evidence basis. So everything was very much backed up. But yeah, great integrative approaches to cancer management that were coming out there.
Nice. And so what specifically were some of these fish hooks that we should be sort of cautious of?
Well, I think the main thing is that, we have a lot of, the way the scientific progression obviously works, and you know this, and your readers, your listeners will know a lot about this as well, is we start with in vitro evidence, and then we move into animal in vivo, and then we move into human in vivo. But even more importantly, we move into human in vivo in situ. In other words, we're going from basically the petri dish, the test tube, into animals, into humans, and then looking at how various things that we might apply actually work in real humans living real lives, right? And the first fish hook really is that there's probably not enough evidence or research at this stage to know exactly when to apply a ketogenic diet, for example, or know exactly when to apply ketones. Across the board, the evidence suggests that, of course, ketogenic diets, ketones, ketosis are beneficial for cancer, right, on balance. But there are additional fish hooks within that, and some of the biggest ones are that some cancer cells can become very good at using beta-hydroxybutyrate. So this is when, people always talk about the metabolic basis for cancer and the Warburg effect, whereby most cancer cells are predominantly glycolytic. So that the idea, and it's actually a fair idea, and it works in practice most of the time, but the idea is that by having less blood glucose, more blood ketones, relying more on ketones and having that reliance on glucose reduced, that we can effectively starve cancer cells. And that's actually fair in many cases. But there are some where those cancer cells can become very aggressive in the presence of high levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate. So I think it still warrants a bit of caution. It also means that the person who's treating cancer patients, I think, with a ketogenic diet just needs to understand a fair bit about metabolic efficiency, metabolic flexibility, and how fuels are used in the body. I think there's a lot of people applying these things without really understanding what they're talking about.
Beautiful. So are you giving a sort of summary of current research, or yeah?
Exactly. That's exactly what it was. It was a 2-part presentation. So the first hour I was speaking specifically to the research on, what's been done with ketogenic diets, ketones, ketosis for cancer. And that obviously brought up a lot of the metabolic basis of that treatment modality, but also that went into all those fish hooks and those cautions. The second part was really about how do we apply ketogenic diets. So that was where it was really translational, looking at how we can apply ketogenic diets, what some of the considerations might be specifically for cancer treatment. So some of the things that, these were all pretty much all doctors that we were talking to there, doctors and oncologists. So things they might look for as potential markers for the use of ketogenic diets or not.
And of course, this is an adjunct to the treatment. As you said, you're talking with oncologists and doctors. Is this right?
Yeah. So I think that the message that came across quite clearly was a good one. I think that it's not about either or. It's about what's complementary, and obviously one of the things we know about just the ketogenic diet, for example, is it has an adjunctive treatment nature with radiation therapy and chemotherapy. So it can promote the benefits of those treatments as well. It improves those treatments. So that's one aspect. But the other speakers were talking about all the other things that you might apply, and when, chemotherapy should and shouldn't be applied versus what other interventions can be applied around that, how to basically do that in the best way. So like I say, it was very evidence-based, and the people who were presenting were, medical doctors and oncologists of massive amounts of experience, decades and decades of experience talking about case studies, but also speaking to the literature. And so it's just a really great environment to be in and around, because you can have positions that are far too orthodox and they haven't given great results. We know the nutritional guidelines that have been given to cancer patients have worsened outcomes. I mean, that's a fact at this point, and many researchers have spoken about that. On the other hand, you have people who don't probably understand the underlying science, sometimes drawing a very long bow and possibly worsening outcomes as well, because we do actually need to exercise some caution.
Just one thing that I'd love to hear your opinion on, the sort of idea around it is to prime the cancer cell and put your I suppose normal cells into, make them dormant. But then also there's always a query around, well, are you going to lose too much protein if you're on a ketogenic diet, or if you're trying to boost ketones with fasting? How protective?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, how protective of your protein is the having beta hydroxybutyrate around?
I think, pretty protective. And one of the things that has been demonstrated, and I think it flies under the radar a little bit, but I know Antti Manninen wrote a really great paper on this a few years back. He summarized a lot of the research around the protective nature of just low carb, high fat diet. So I wasn't talking about ketogenic diets specifically, but obviously most of those are going to be ketogenic. They're all going to have high levels of ketones anyway, and they're going to encourage greater levels of fatty oxidation regardless. George Cahill has spoken about this as well. But basically there is typically less lean tissue loss when we have that production of beta hydroxybutyrate. There's obviously not the same stimulus for gluconeogenesis from tissue, the creation of glucose from tissue. And even in the early phases, I would typically think that even in the first couple of days, we probably would break down a fair bit of tissue. But he cast that into doubt as well. But one of the interesting things specifically around cancer treatment, which several of the doctors brought up, which I actually agree with and have, built into my cancer treatment programs, is I don't think the protein needs to be as low as people have suggested, for two reasons. You don't need to have extraordinarily low protein levels to get into ketosis, number one. You do if you're trying to treat acute seizures by getting over like 3 millimoles, but if you're trying to get into nutritional ketosis, you don't necessarily need to limit protein at all. And the other point of that is a lot of people are worried about protein being converted to glucose, number one, which can obviously fuel a lot of those cancer cells, or number two, glutamine coming from the protein that we ingest and that fueling some cancer cells. I don't necessarily buy those arguments completely. I think there is at some point that might kick in, but we need to consider that gluconeogenesis is not supply driven, it's demand driven. And that people are talking about that a lot now, thankfully, because the idea that you simply provide a bunch of protein to someone and they're going to convert, people used to say, oh, you'll convert 40% of the protein you eat to glucose. Like, why? It's very arbitrary, It's driven by demand. If your body's demanding glucose, it will then find it. If you have beta hydroxybutyrate available to reduce the reliance on glucose, there's not going to be the same demand there. So gluconeogenesis isn't necessarily massive. And so there's not going to be a huge amount of glucose provided from the protein you're eating. The other thing that plays into the next argument around glutamine is I actually think we need to supply enough protein so that we don't have a tendency to tap into tissue. Because when we're tapping into tissue and when we become more catabolic, and of course there's going to be more breakdown if we're not eating enough protein, that's standard, right? I mean, you see that in aging. If you're eating under 1.2, 1.4 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day, muscle loss is drastically increased. When we have that muscle loss, what we need to remember is that glutamine is the most abundant amino acid in tissue, right? So you have increased muscle breakdown, there's going to be increased glutamine. That's potentially going to fuel cancer cells. And so it was a really refreshing point of view that several of the researchers and doctors had, that they were saying, look, we don't want to reduce protein too much, because I thought I was going to get a bit of blowback about that. While I did suggest that we need to be exercise some caution around really high levels of protein, I think normal levels of protein that would optimize performance and reduce muscle loss are exactly what we need in that situation.
Yeah, and continuing on that, one of the things when I was working with Steve Joe and say for my partner working with Steve Joe, he was to prescribe protein to boost hormones and immune function and also adrenal glands. Do you think that if you're going through a disease like cancer and treatment for cancer, that might be quite important?
Absolutely. And, cachexia is a big problem in cancer. Loss of muscle and loss of tissue is a big problem in cancer. And so we need to support that, but we also obviously need to support, the adrenal hormones, the amino acid based hormones that we have. We basically need to support every system. And in many respects, there are nuances that come into treatment of any disease. And with particular respect to cancer, there are some things that we obviously want to do to treat the disorder. But probably 80% of what we're doing is really what we would think would be conducive to going on and living a healthy life. And that's probably fair to say with most illnesses. We need to basically start the way we mean to go on, assuming that we hopefully get some good outcomes there. And so a big part of that is providing the things that the body needs. And, I've seen, unfortunately, cancer patients just stripped of protein because people have been so scared about this creation of glucose, and it really hasn't helped. So, I sort of often see my role as being someone who can come in and who is holistic, but is also very evidence-based and can sort of take a pragmatic worldview of what they're doing and see where things are quackery versus things that are actually scientifically valid.
And I guess one of the arguments people will come in with is you don't want to activate mTOR. Does that really fit in? I know Rob Wolf's delved into it with Chris Masterjohn that, hey, this mTOR is a sometimes switch, an as needed switch as well. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think he's right. And I think we have bigger fish to fry, because there is so much going on and it's so complex. An analogy for that is, people talk about IGF as well. Don't have too much protein because it's going to signal an increase in insulin-like growth factor. But the point I made in the weekend is all these little things that people are talking about that, yes, they are signaling mechanisms for cancer, or in the case of mTOR, for anabolism in general, right? Are they more important than what we're losing? And if we have, for example, a very low protein diet, is the effect that we'll get from that outweighed by the negative, I would say. On the other hand, you talk about IGF-1, and a lot of people say, well, don't go on a sufficient protein diet because that will signal increases in IGF-1, but we've got to look at what's the alternative. You're either on a very low protein, very high fat diet, or you're going back to a more conservative sort of orthodox approach. And that conservative orthodox approach is going to have much higher levels of carbohydrate. And if we're talking about a best practice approach, which has typically been eat everything you can, including lots of sugar and all that kind of stuff, to just try and hold the weight on, the effect on IGF-1 is going to be way more than having a little bit of extra protein. So it's about looking at things really in balance. And I guess the other aspect to that is, what is going to be a bigger promoter of growth for a cancer cell, which is typically, not always, but typically relatively inflexible? Is it going to be minor signaling aspects, or is it going to be the fact that that cell is so hungry, it needs fuel and needs lots of it, right? It doesn't have the ability to produce those massive amounts of ATP that it would usually produce through normal oxidative phosphorylation. It's basically relying on glycolysis or glutaminolysis, in some cases the use of ketones, but that they're relatively starved anyway, which is why they're so hungry, which is why other things happen. Cancer cells co-opt adjacent cells to give them fuel. So fueling is really one of the biggest aspects we need to be concerned about.
No, and Jason Fung has a great series of articles about, wanting to get that fuel and wanting to do that fermentation so it can survive.
Exactly.
So it's been nearly a year since we've talked to you, and you've been head down in your PhD.
Yeah.
What's something that you might have learned over the last year or changed your mind about over the last year?
It's a great question. It's a really great question. I go back and forward a little bit. I like to have a really pragmatic viewpoint around around low carb. And, my baseline position is that there is a spectrum, and some people do thrive on a higher carb diet. I think overall, though, that as we've discussed in the past, most people have been told to eat far too much carbohydrate. I think that's a fact. And I think probably everyone accepts that now. But then where on that sort of low carb spectrum should you fit in? And one of the things that we've really tried to delve into a little bit more is how do we predict that, And I know that there's a lot of gene testing companies who are claiming to predict that, but I think the evidence for the AMI1 copy numbers is pretty equivocal at the moment. There needs to be a lot more there because we're seeing a lot of conflicting results. I think there is, limited evidence that we have to actually be able to predict the type of diet that someone should be on. I'm getting to a point, I promise. We ran our trial last year that we're writing up now into 4 separate papers at this point. Basically looked at the differences between outcomes from three differing low carb diets. So one featuring 25% calories from carbs, one featuring 15% calories from carbs, and one 5% calories from carbs. And even in our first paper, which is kind of a broad just comparison paper, so we're just looking at the outcomes, what did the people on the different diets achieve? There was better outcomes from the very low carb diet overall, more weight loss, better improvements in blood lipids and things like that. And as we're delving into the data more, we think, and we need to analyze this in greater depth, but we think we're seeing what we expected, which is that baseline metabolic indicators probably do have some predictive value for what type of diet you should be on. In other words, the worse your triglycerides, the worse your HDL at baseline, the lower the carbs you should be on. To the point where in the 25% group, it probably went the other way. So if your baseline triglycerides are really good, for example, you might have been better off on the 25% carb or higher diet. Mm-hmm. If your triglycerides are really bad, you're probably not even going to get benefits from 15%. You need to be much lower than that. That's pretty cool, because if we can actually tease out some of that data and maybe replicate some of that, that does give a very simple measure for people to look at. And it's something that I've suspected for a long time. I know people have thrown the insulin resistance versus insulin sensitive hypothesis out a little bit. But I think there's a lot more going on in a lot of the studies that are coming out than the abstracts and conclusions show. I don't want to just keep talking without you having the chance to ask any questions, but I do want to mention, because it's relevant, the Diet Fit study. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that one came out recently? It was probably the biggest study of its type, $8 million to fund large numbers of people. I think it was around 600, I'll have to remember, but I think it was around 600 people following either a lower carb or lower fat diet over a year. And the way it was presented in the media and by a lot of other scientists actually was, this is the nail in the low carb coffin, because there was no difference in outcomes over a year. There was actually a difference in outcomes though. And there's a few fish hooks in that. There was no difference in weight or fat loss over a year. And most markers, there was no significant difference between the groups. However, there was a significant difference between the groups in triglycerides and HDL. To me, that's important, because that shows that the nail is not in the low carb coffin. That shows that over a long period of time, which we know, if you can adhere to a good diet, because they were both very good diets, it was a good lower fat versus good lower carb diet, you will get very similar results. However, is the nail in the coffin when you get very similar results, except that the best predictors of cardiovascular disease mortality are improved on one diet only. To me, that's not the nail in the coffin. To me, that basically says that there is still a trend towards low carb being more effective, because it was. The other thing to consider there is they excluded people with metabolic syndrome, diabetes, pre-diabetes. And that's often done because you have to have that, homogeneous cohort to get the best results, or the most consistent sort of results that you can actually draw some relevance from. But if you had people there following, what's that?
No, we're good. Just tipped for a second. Carry on. Sorry, mate.
So if you had people with, worse baseline cardiometabolic indicators, as you would see with people who were severely insulin resistant or had pre-diabetes, metabolic syndrome, we would expect, based on our results, that the results from low carb would be even better as well. So I'm certainly not suggesting that everyone should be low carb. What I'm saying is that overall, the trend is still towards there being a better effect for long-term mortality from reduced carbohydrate diets. There's not really any doubt in my mind about that now.
No, and yeah, I think what was cool with what you released the other day, we snippet of one of the graphs showing time and ketosis of those 3 diet protocols was, even though they're a little bit higher and away from this prescribed amount of carbs, people were still getting into a state where their body was, if you call it starvation or fat adapted or ketone adapted. Yeah, it was quite
Exactly. I mean, particularly on the 15% group, right? And people would say, well, 15% is still very low carb, but we've got to remember as well that these participants were having a relatively high amount of protein, around 1.4 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day. So that equated for most of them to being around 25%. So there's still, that's 60% calories from fat, and they weren't using MCTs. And a lot of those people, in fact, the majority were still in ketosis consistently. Even people on the 25% carb diet, many of those were entering ketosis. And that means that they were only having about 50% of their calories from fat. So they had 25 protein, 25 carbs, 50 fat, and they're still entering ketosis. So it shows, if nothing else, the fairly extreme variability between individuals, and how we have a spectrum of both carb tolerance, fat adaptation, and also keto adaptation. So it's pretty interesting, because I think what it's doing now is it's blowing the doors off this old mindset that it's a switch. You're either in or you're out. You basically have to be extremely low carb and extremely low protein to get any sort of viable result. And that's certainly not the case. It really differs between individuals.
No, cool. And I think that follows along quite well with what Karen was saying about when they did the first 2 days of the week fasted, that actually on a lower carbohydrate diet, they managed to maintain that level of ketosis. And something else I've been starting to look at is these guys with the type 1 grit community who are on a low carb, high protein diet based on I think it's Dr. Bernstein method, and the sort of numbers of blood sugar that's better than most normal people, and maintaining a level of ketosis with this larger amount of protein.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing. We have a legacy at the moment based on all of the early research. We've got to remember that from the early 1900s through to really the late 70s, all the research on ketosis was pretty much geared towards epilepsy. And even though now we know that for chronic treatment of epilepsy, maybe the beta-hydroxybutyrate levels don't need to be as high as was previously thought, there is certainly a lot of evidence to still show that for acute seizure control, really it's about the higher the better, right? And we see tipping points above sort of 2 or 3 millimoles, which is why it was never really used enough probably as a treatment, because it was really difficult, although it was so effective, and it is so effective, to have kids following a 90% fat diet. It doesn't work functionally because it's too hard to adhere to, and you feel like crap because protein's great. Protein makes you feel satiated, and it provides those, amino acid based neurotransmitters and things. Your mood is lifted, typically cognition's better. And so you feel like crap. It's hard to adhere to, and you get poor growth rates in kids just because there's simply not enough protein. Now, thankfully, people are moving away from that, but we still have this legacy where people think that ketosis is a game where you've got to chase higher and higher levels. We had a hard time getting one of our papers through recently through peer review because the reviewer would not accept that, the level, the definition of ketosis could be as low as 0.5. But the reality is that's what has become the lingua franca now, because that's when we begin to actually see defined tipping points in people's behaviors, how they feel and how they perform. So although it was to some degree a qualitative assessment by Steve Phinney back in the late 70s, early 80s, it has become now a dividing line. And, we've had Gucci and colleagues and I think about 2 other papers that have used it as a dividing line. We published 3 papers last year that used it as a threshold as well. And so it is becoming now the sort of proxy marker for what is ketosis. And it works because, if you've got a normal mainstream person who just wants to get to the gym a couple of times a week and be lean and have great brain health and prevent neurodegenerative disorders. 0.5 to 1.5, great, who cares? You know, I don't need to necessarily chase higher levels. And what I often tell my students is, would you chase higher levels of glucose? And everyone's like, no, of course not. Well, why chase higher and higher levels of ketones if they're not required? It all comes down to fuel availability, really. And that's a topic that I'm sure you heard Dr. Dan Plews and I discussed the other day on my podcast, was this idea of total fuel availability and how that's critically important. Why just have truckloads of fuel floating around in the blood if you don't need it? Another good analogy, would you chase high levels of triglycerides in the blood? No way. No way. It makes no sense.
No, you bring up Dan Plews. I have only just come across Dan. It was, I think it might have been Rob Wolf speaking to a bodybuilder, and he'd come across Dan in the States, and I was like, oh, who's this guy? And I've tracked him down on Twitter, and yeah, very, very interested. Now, going back to the epilepsy story, very good podcast with Dr. Dan D'Agostino, Don D'Agostino and Peter Adzir the other day, and they're speaking about how maybe, you know, that they can adapt this epilepsy diet with MCTs and adapt this epilepsy diet with exogenous ketones as well.
Yeah.
With your study that you released end of last year with Mickey Willard, and you're talking about that keto induction period, and there's a little bit of argument about, well, if we're supplementing with exogenous ketones, well, then maybe we're slowing down the endogenous production. But I rewatched it again the other day. You had a good video about how if the fuel's there, what would we need to make it? And what sort of Dom was saying, that it's about the concentration of beta-hydroxybutyrate that seems to be beneficial. Why would we need to be in a ketosis state if we've got the fuel? If you can talk on that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was Pete Huttenlocher and his colleagues back in the 70s who kind of blew the doors off ketogenic diets, to my mind, because they were the ones who applied MCTs and showed that you could achieve ketosis at the same levels as was clinically indicated for epilepsy at the time, with a much lower intake of fat. So then you could have concomitantly higher levels of protein and carbohydrate. So that changed things, and it didn't change them enough, because, you know, what I think should have happened there is we should have had basically all epilepsy patients on a modified MCT keto diet, because it's easy to achieve ketosis, it's easy to adhere to, you can have more protein, you know, all the good things we were sort of discussing before, they're there. It didn't happen because the idea was it's still too difficult, so let's just use drugs. But obviously having that as available is critically important for epilepsy, but also for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, any of the disorders that are going to benefit from higher levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate in the blood, no doubt. And so MCTs, number one, fantastic, because of course they're providing the base, and they are ketogenic in and of themselves. So they are basically being converted to ketones. They're not ketones themselves, but they're also encouraging the ancillary creation of ketones from long chain fats as well. So then you get a really nice ketogenic base. When it comes to ketones, it's interesting because there is the idea that, and we actually put this in our paper because we had to, you know, ketones can inhibit ketone production, endogenous ketogenesis, because they're not ketogenic. And we were really looking at ketogenic supplements in our review. So we had to mention the study by, who was it, Blasé, back in 1975, where inhibition of ketogenesis was shown, right? But as I did a couple of videos after that, after we published that review, just to show people that the inhibition is very minor and it's very limited. And we've got to remember, in that study, which is really the only one that people speak to, right? You can see inhibition in animal studies, but that's the human study that people point to all the time. The levels of ketosis in those participants was really high because they'd been fasted for between 3 and 23 days. And so basically you saw levels of ketones between 3 and 11, right? Pretty high. And the level of inhibition that you got from IVing acetoacetate into those people, which obviously spontaneously broke down to BHB pretty quickly, the inhibition was proportionate to the level of beta-hydroxybutyrate, which was identical or, proportionate to the length of time they'd been fasting. But it was only 10 to 31%, right? So if you're at 3 millimoles of beta-hydroxybutyrate and you're IVing acetoacetate into yourself, so you're getting a whole lot of exogenous beta-hydroxybutyrate, basically, you're getting a whole lot of exogenous ketone anyway, flowing into the body, and it drastically boosts your ketone levels, as it would, but your inhibition of your own endogenous production was only 10%, it doesn't matter. And it basically rebounds, we think at least, pretty much straight away, because it's just a simple, substrate availability feedback loop. It's like if you have, no one's there saying don't eat carbohydrate, because if you eat carbohydrate, it reduces your gluconeogenesis. Of course it does. And then when you don't have carbohydrate available, you upregulate your gluconeogenesis and your hepatic glucose output. It's pretty much the same for ketones. What people forget, I think, fundamentally, is we produce ketones all the time. Irrespective of whether you're on high, moderate, low carb diet, you produce them all the time. And it's basically a spectrum. You reduce carbohydrate, you produce more. You will have known this taking your own beta-hydroxybutyrate levels. Let's say the first day of a keto diet where you still have quite a lot of glucose availability because your liver's pushing out lots of its hepatic glucose. What happens though? You might go from, I re-went into a keto diet because, when you're traveling, you typically can't be keto all the time, or I don't want to be anyway. I like airline food. But I went back into keto yesterday, and it was interesting because I measured my levels through the day, and in the morning I'm like 0.1. And then it goes up to 0.2 mid-morning, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, basically over the day, right? All that early morning or all that early day period, people would say, well, you're not in ketosis. But you see a linear rise in ketones as your glucose reserve begins to drop. There's basically just a balance there. And people often forget about that. It's kind of like no carbs. I'm going to try my best to have carbohydrate within the body. And then as soon as there's not enough, bang, you're producing lots of ketones. And don't take any exogenous ketones because that's going to stop that production. It's like, no, it's all fluid. It's dynamic. It changes.
Yeah. And that's something, especially when you do something like a 60-hour fast, and I've done water fast or assisted fast, and it's still that sort of 3 o'clock on the second day that you start to go, oh, here we go. And when the levels start to really boost up, and that's been with or without the use of ketones.
Yeah, and that's what is also so exciting now is people can achieve underlying metabolic changes and mitochondrial changes and things like that, and have the ability to have tools like MCTs, like exogenous ketones, which allow them to boost those levels so they get the best results, whether that just means feeling better or having better cognition, or for a lot of our patients, to actually achieve the levels that are really going to help them, And I think that's critically important. The effects that I've seen in traumatic brain injury patients is insane, right? It's crazy.
I'm a equals one of bad concussion, taking the ketones and passing a SCAT 5.5 an hour, and a number of people that are supplied ketones to are because they have traumatic brain injury, and even Rakanui, who we interviewed on here, that had worked with Dom D'Agostino, he doesn't take ketones, but being in a ketogenic diet and taking MCTs, has changed his life. So
yeah,
like you say, dramatic improvement in cognitive ability and
absolutely,
and mood and all those good things that allow you to function.
And that's what I mean about tools as well. Like for my TBI patients, they're typically on a keto diet, but it's a sufficient protein keto diet. They're using MCT, so they've got the base of ketone production. They've always got some exogenous ketones there as well. Not to necessarily have to use habitually, because let's face it, some people can't afford it or whatever, but they're there as a tool. If they get brain fog or they've got to, go to work, if they're returning to work, which can be quite difficult, then they've got that there basically as a boost. And to my mind, it does function as a very effective boost. You know, I use exogenous ketones for the same purpose when I'm working hard and long. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure, having sustained so many concussions playing footy and getting punched in the face, that I've sustained some damage to the brain, and ketones make my brain feel better. Straight up, right? And it makes sense. Now, I'm also aware that those concussions might have an association with later neurodegenerative disorders. I'm definitely going to be very aware of that. And I take MCTs daily for that purpose. And I take ketones, you know, as a prophylactic as well.
That's right. Yeah. And since last year, what I've started doing is dosing up ketones on a Friday, Saturday morning and Sunday to, one, be protective in the game, and then two, hopefully help with the recovery and help with the inflammation.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, I'm trying to remember. What's Brian's last name? You know, the keto doc from Aussie. I forget his name. He's going to kill me now. But there's a number of guys now who are working with contact sports, you know, footy, ice hockey, American football, basically doing the same thing, having ketones and or MCTs before the game as a prophylactic against, because there is a big prophylactic effect, right? Because so much of the actual destruction that occurs as a result of head trauma is not just the physical trauma, it's the immediate effects related to hypoxia and things like that. Or hypoxia and transient glucose unavailability and things like that. There's a lot of neurodegeneration that occurs in the very short time afterwards that is what we think is concussion, but it's actually almost like a post-trauma aspect of the concussion.
No, I was glad I had that knowledge when I got whacked badly in the head. One of the things that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the paper that you guys released, that you couldn't actually find any mention of keto flu. Was that correct?
Yeah, at the time when we started doing our research, we were surprised actually, and not so much that keto flu wasn't mentioned. We thought it might be because it's such a common term, you know, in the mainstream sort of or grey literature. So I think it was around 22,000 references to keto flu on a standard Google search and 0 in the academic literature. But also even more than that, there was almost no literature. There was literature that talked about the side effects or the adverse effects of a keto diet, but they talked about it very broadly. So it might be a study that's done for 3 weeks, for example, or for 12 weeks, and they talk about some of the adverse effects that were observed, or even the proportions of adverse effects that were observed and things like that. But no one had talked about the specific time frame of keto induction. And we believe that's pretty important because that's a big barrier to entry for some people. It's also a great sort of area to look into in terms of improving people's just experience of a diet. Is if you can mitigate those symptoms, that's pretty important. And so when we did that narrative review, yeah, there was basically nothing out there. Now, of course, you'll find 3 papers that mention, you know, keto flu or carbohydrate withdrawal symptoms, and that's because those are those 3 papers that we published last year. So it's obviously that MCT study, a narrative review, and a qualitative paper on a ketogenic diet.
Awesome. Leading the way in the research. So that's really cool.
It's nice to have a very small niche.
Speaking of niches as well, when we talk about exogenous ketones, the question of enantiomers and isomers, especially with the salts, whether you're getting L and D, and again, this was something that Tom was speaking very sort of loosely with Peter Attia, you know, that yes, it matters for the endogenous production, but then he also found that there was positive effects even with having the L in the system anyway. So what's so far your take on what's the story with enantiomers and the different isomers with the salts?
Yeah, I think the reality is that the body, as far as what I've read and even what Dom's said and other sort of researchers have said, the L form is is less effective to the point of perhaps being ineffective, right? But it can, from what Dom has written, he suspects that around 80% of it over time can be converted to the D form, and so it can have some efficacy. So I think the challenge for me is that I don't think anyone's really looked at the effects on those specific sort of butyrate-like receptors and whether the L form has sort of antagonistic effect there. You know, in a similar way to perhaps unmetabolized folate, you know, I'm worried about that to some degree. It may end up being not much of an issue, but certainly in the animal research, we see that those synthetic folic acid varieties like pteromonoglutamate do tend to promote negative outcomes, right? And considering everyone takes multivitamins that have synthetic folic acid pteromonoglutamate in them, you've got unmetabolized folate floating around attaching to those receptors and basically stopping the natural folate, the methylated folates, from doing its job. The evidence suggests that that's probably not a good thing, and it could in the long term lead to fatigue and perhaps impaired immunity, maybe even carcinogenesis over time, right? So my concern is that if we have the form that is not naturally produced within the body and that does have some receptor activity, but it's maybe not doing the job or not doing the job effectively, then even though it may eventually be converted to D form and be efficacious for fuel production and things, is there still a risk there? Now, it may not be a problem at all, but I always take a sort of prudent approach. If we don't have enough evidence and there could be a risk, I just go for 100% D form. So, you know, that's basically why I use what I use, because it is 100% D, and that's what I go for now. And that's what I get all my patients taking, because I also kind of figure that there are ways to get, you know, the products at pretty good prices. If you're looking at a product being slightly cheaper, but it's a 50-50 racemic mixture of D and L, I'd go for the one that's fractionally more expensive, because it's probably actually just as good value for money at the end of the day, because it's a more usable form.
Nice. And so are you going with induction and fat adaptability? How do you then sort of target ketones and target carbohydrates for those higher energy people? I know Rob was keen on something from Keto Gains where they, before they do something intense, they have a bolus of carbohydrate. You know, what's your sort of experience with that? I know you've got plenty of friends within the CrossFit community, which I've just started and I haven't had too much problem.
Yeah, guys like, what hat are you wearing?
You're wearing a CrossFit hat.
I am, yeah, CrossFit Mana.
Yeah.
I love this hat. I gave a talk to those guys. It's AJ's gym down in Palmy. Nice. And I went down and gave a talk for those guys a while back, and they gave me a hat, and I love it, so I wear it all the time. But I do one ward a year as well. I'll shout out to Luke McGrew. He knows that I do one ward a year. But yeah, CrossFit's an interesting one, because, you know, you look at the Rachel Gregory. Rachel Gregory did some research, and she put CrossFit people on a keto diet, and there was basically no detriment to performance. It all tracked exactly the same, no change, no shift, whatever. But you got to remember, those are people who are, you know, maybe doing 3 or 4 WODs a week. So they're your recreational athlete. Of course, their demand, even though it's very glycolytic, their demand for carbohydrate overall is pretty low, just because their fuel requirement overall is pretty low. When you look at a top level athlete who's doing repeated sessions and multiple sessions a day and doing huge volumes in a week, of course, there's going to be some demand there for additional glucose. I don't agree with the idea of having carbohydrate before training. You know, even though a lot of people say to do that, because you've got to supply the glucose that's going to be involved in those glycolytic activities, those higher intensity activities, I don't think that's the right time to do it. If you take carbohydrate before exercise, you're basically, and this is, you know, well demonstrated, you're going to reduce your fatty oxidation, you're going to upregulate your glycolysis. That's independent of what the demands of the activity are, right? Because the demands of the activity for the individual in the moment, although they can fat adapt over a long period of time, they're going to be identical in terms of what they actually require glucose for versus creatine phosphate versus fatty acids versus ketones. So from my point of view, you make sure your muscle glycogen stores are optimized, not maximized, but optimized for your activity, but you don't have carbs before training or events. I would typically prefer to have people having carbs after the event, because they're probably going to absorb and uptake them more effectively. It's more likely that with that high stimulation of muscle tissue, there's going to be proportionately more stored in muscle versus liver. Obviously, once it's in muscle, it's there for use later on. Liver is a little bit problematic because then it's going to drip out over the subsequent days and going to inhibit ketogenesis if that's your goal. And so typically I'd have carbohydrate after training rather than before, or in some cases during. So that's where, having a little bit of extra carb during is not a problem. There have been performance benefits in some studies seen from co-ingestion of ketones and carbohydrate. So why not? Some of the studies which show a negative effect of ketone ingestion on like time trial performance and things were pretty sort of much designed to fail studies. So we wouldn't really consider those too much. And then basically just having the amount of carbohydrate that overall that is consistent with your fuel demands. This is why, and I know you've sort of looked into this, some of my work before, this is why I often talk about percentages of calories from fat versus carbohydrate versus absolute grams. Because you can't tell me that, to be keto, someone doing 5 hours of training a day versus someone doing 1 hour of training a day should arbitrarily all be under 20 or 50 grams per day. Makes no sense, because there's going to be greater uptake into muscle for the person exercising more. There's going to be more glycolysis anyway. There's going to be a greater exhaustion on liver glycogen supplies, and they're going to be more insulin sensitive anyway, right? And so there's going to be a whole number of things come into play, which basically predetermine that person will be able to take in more carbohydrate and still be very well fat adapted, which is actually why we see some people who are incredibly well fat adapted, even if they had a really high carb diet. They still burn truckloads of fat and they're still metabolically flexible, but they can take in those carbs because of, ethnicity, genetics, activity factors.
Yeah, and that's some of the pragmatism I like from Rob, is that he does sort of say that exactly that if you're doing this high level activity, you're using and burning that level of carbohydrate and needing that energy, and your overall caloric intake is so much larger, and so therefore the amount of carbohydrate you need to intake is larger again. So it's cool to see that sort of thing come through. And then he does also talk about how different people are sensitive to carbohydrates in different ways, and he highlights that very well working with his wife. They eat the same food and watch their glucose and ketones, and his wife could be get good levels and his plummet.
Oh, definitely. That's this is a little bit tangential, but in the paper by Cahill, I think it was from 2004, but he wrote that narrative review, which was a great narrative review of basically his life and research. It was an amazing paper because he was basically summarizing his life and research as an academic paper, and it was really cool. It's a really foundational paper for ketosis, ketogenesis. It was basically about the use of fuels during starvation, right? And it was interesting in that paper, he makes the point that a bear, when it's hibernating, doesn't go into ketosis. The reason being that it has so much stored fat, and when it's breaking down that fat for fuel, it has more than enough to supply its very low glucose requirement from the glycerol backbone of fat. Mainly because it's got a big brain, but proportionate to the size of its body, the brain is very small. Whereas proportionate to the size of a human body, our brain is very big. And this is why babies are very ketotic, because they've got such a big brain compared to their body. It's enormous. In the animal kingdom, the brain of a human baby is enormous compared to its body. And in smaller people, they have bigger brains compared to their bodies.
Right. Yeah.
It's an interesting one. Like he made the point of a sumo wrestler where its brain metabolic fuel requirement might be less than 10%, whereas in other people it might be sort of 25%. They may actually be less likely to go into ketosis for the sole reason that their body, as it's breaking down adipose tissue to provide fuel from fatty acids, not breaking down adipose tissue, but freeing up fats from adipose tissue to use as fuel, will have more than enough glycerol there to provide for the glucose that the brain and central nervous system needs. it's pretty interesting because there's things that haven't even been really considered in the research, right? We haven't really looked at body size as a determinant of ketogenesis.
And that just triggered off something in my head, that might be another reason why Dave Feldman's LDL hyperresponder happens, that these lean people need their fatty acids. And so the thing that carries them around, the LDL, gets boosted up because they need it for their brain health.
Oh, exactly. And this is why I think people are too, unfortunately, I think when we simplify things down, especially to the nth degree, and we make, these arbitrary sort of judgments on things within the body, like good versus bad cholesterol, we can end up fighting a bit of a backwards battle, because then everyone's like, well, HDL is good, right? And LDL is bad. But it doesn't really recognize the intricacies of the body, because nothing is bad. Things do a job, right? Even when we talk, from the cancer talk in the weekend, when people were talking about the inherent nature of cancer as a protective thing for the body, that has then become excessive. If we didn't have that sort of, those stem cells that help to heal wounds and heal, gross trauma and things like that, we wouldn't survive very long. So we actually need that sort of, that primal vestigial state of cancer as a very important healing mechanism within the body. And then because of all these multi-related factors that come in, from genetics through to lifestyle factors, environmental pollutants and all sorts of things, we then get a perfect storm that creates this problem. And that's typically what we see within our blood markers as well. Our cardiometabolic status is quite intricate. And we can't consider total cholesterol in the absence of, looking at HDL versus LDL versus the particle sizes of those versus triglycerides and things like that. Of course, we can take more simplistic measures where we might just say, well, on balance, we're going to look at maybe triglycerides, HDL, and HbA1c as probably being some pretty good proxy markers for what's actually happening within the body. And if those are great, I don't really care if someone's LDL is elevated.
Yeah.
It shows it's needed within the body. And as Peter Attia's made the point many times, don't ever look at a snapshot. Even if it's supposedly something which is indicative of long-term trends, it may not always be. What you eat, if you have a big cup of coffee with cream before you go and get your fasted blood test, I mean, your trigs are going to be all over the place.
Yeah, and that's another one of Dave Feldman's things. There's make sure you're fasted before you go into that, and avoid the coffee because it throws the trigs all over the place.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely.
Yeah. And that segued perfectly. Talking of coffee, an alternative to coffee is mushrooms, and I've just got a mixed blend from Superfeast arrived. Alex ordered it the other day, and I can't wait to try that in my coffee this morning. What do mushrooms do for you? I see, again, when you're doing work, you get into different types of mushrooms. Which ones are your favorites, and what do you use them for?
Oh, mate, I got put onto the Four Sigmatic stuff a while back. I think because of a post Tim Ferriss did, and I'm a massive fan. I've been looking sort of loosely at mushrooms for many years because we use them in some of our products as well. But really looking at some of the potential benefits, for overall health, immune function, and, some of the maybe potential effect on reducing carcinogenesis and things like that. But I hadn't really looked recently enough at the functional outcomes right now. And I started looking particularly into lion's mane, and there's actually quite a lot of research out there now on it. And it's not just in vitro and it's not just animal in vivo. There's a lot of human outcome evidence too. And we see pretty strongly that it does encourage neurogenesis. So it's very protective for the brain. It helps, drastically improve recovery rates for peripheral nerve injuries or for even damage within the brain and spinal cord. But when we translate that into other functional rather than structural or mechanistic outcomes, there's a pretty big effect on cognition and perceived exertion. So it has performance effects, but a lot of those are particularly related to mental performance. So I started using lion's mane, and I notice a massive difference. For me, the effect on cognition and productivity, focus is huge. And so I typically stack that up with MCTs, ketones, basically anything that's neurogenic. And the brain just feels like it's flying. So I'm a massive fan. And since then, because of the lion's mane experience, I've really started delving into mushrooms a lot more. And, looking into the immune boosting properties of chaga and, the relaxing properties of reishi. And now, there's more research coming out about the anti-cancer properties of shiitake and mitake and all those types of mushrooms as well. So I'm actually doing a talk on the use of medicinal mushrooms, basically, or, culinary / medicinal mushrooms at IE Produce in Auckland, I think in a month or two. I'm just going to I can't remember what the date is exactly, but yeah, I'm really into it. And it's weird because it's not outside of my wheelhouse, because obviously we learn a lot about the use of medicinal herbs and medicinal mushrooms in naturopathy, which is my undergrad was in naturopathy. But it's interesting that a number of people who are involved in the metabolic and sort of fat adaptation space, like your Bill Lagarkoses and others like that, are all becoming really interested in mushrooms now.
Yeah, I think it's that finding one thing that gives your brain a boost, and then here's another one that really does have a marked effect. Like Alex took it yesterday, and she's dealing with a small baby, and she said, I noticed a difference. My mood felt greater, my energy felt really good, and again, it's N equals 1, and there's a little bit of maybe placebo in that, but I don't know, when you feel as good as that just from having a cup of something, it's hard to argue with.
Yeah, and I mean, whenever I see really glowing case reports, obviously I always take that on board, but I do think, well, let's actually take a look at the evidence here. And that's what I did with lion's mane, and thought, shit, there's actually a lot more than I thought. And it was very compelling. You start to summarize all of that together, and it makes a very compelling case for their use. And so that's when I tried it, and I thought, shit, this is pretty good stuff here. And interestingly, we're talking about TBIs before, but maybe also with neurodegenerative cases as well. But I've particularly applied that stack, with lion's mane, MCTs and ketones with TBI patients. And I think the results are fantastic. And it makes sense because obviously all of the research really focuses on that neurogenic effect that the lion's mane has.
No, absolutely. So it's been a great morning chatting with you, Cliff. Is there anything?
Like always.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with? Of course, I'll put all your details in the show notes, and I'll try to track down that Cahill summary paper as well, because that sounds like a hell of a read.
Yeah, you can find the full text pretty easily online, and it is a really great read. Anyone who's interested in fuel metabolism or ketosis or anything like that, it's well worth a read. And it's pretty accessible because he does write it in a very narrative, literary sort of style, which is really nice. It sort of reminds me of the old days of academia, where people used to be a little bit freer with their writing. They didn't feel so constrained about the dry academic style of writing. And I miss those days sometimes when people actually had bold opinions and things like that. I think it's coming back because people are getting bored.
That'll relate to you going through critique at the moment as well, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Now, what would you like to leave people with, mate?
So apart from that, basically I'm just hammering on with what I'm doing. I don't have a lot of outputs in the next few months as far as books and things like that. I've just got these research outputs to put out. But just so people know, I do have a couple of online lectures coming up because I've been asked to do them on sort of intro to keto for neurodegenerative disorders. So that's particularly for people who, maybe have an interest in that, or practitioners, and ketosis ketogenesis for cancer as well. So sort of summarizing that research that I presented in the weekend in an online lecture for people as well. Again, because people have asked me, can I sort of put that out online? So I'll let you guys know when those are coming out as well.
Fantastic. And so would that be on your Patreon or somewhere else?
It will be. It'll also be open to non-patrons for a small fee as well.
Oh, fantastic.
And all those fees from, Patreon and from webinars and things, they just basically go to fund publications. They go to fund research.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cliff. Have a great day.
Thanks, buddy.
We'll see you again. Cheers.
Good chatting. All right.